I had exactly $412.67 in my checking account, a folded discharge sheet in my coat pocket, and a yellow key card I was never supposed to have. 3 days after my laparoscopic surgery, my husband drained our joint account, moved the title of my bakery into a new LLC, and told his attorney I was too medicated to understand what I was signing. My phone kept buzzing with messages from vendors asking why our fall charity gala had been canceled, and all I could think was that I still smelled faintly like hospital antiseptic and burnt sugar. When my sister said, "Don't worry, he already has the paperwork ready," I understood two things at once. First, they had planned this before I ever went under. Second, if I made one wrong move before Friday's board meeting, I would lose my business, my lease, and the last piece of my mother's name. Let me take you back. My name is Tessa Rowan. I was 38 years old, and I owned a small bakery and event kitchen in Savannah, Georgia, called Magnolia Table. At least, I thought I owned it. My mother had started it with 2 mixers, 1 borrowed oven, and the kind of patience people mistake for softness. After she died, I inherited her recipes, her vendor list, and half her stubbornness. The other half I built myself. My husband, Grant, liked to introduce himself as the man who helped turn a family kitchen into a real business. He said it with that polished laugh men use when they want credit to sound like charm. He handled the numbers, which should have worried me earlier than it did. But when you are working 16-hour days, icing cakes at midnight, and smiling through tastings at 8 in the morning, you start to trust the person who says, "I'll take care of the paperwork." The clock started ticking on a Tuesday afternoon in a recovery room. I was still groggy when my sister Ava walked in wearing heels too sharp for a hospital floor. She kissed my forehead, set flowers on the windowsill, and said, almost casually, "Grant says there's a board packet waiting for you to sign when you get home. Nothing major, just routine ownership housekeeping." I remember staring at her and feeling the room tilt. "What board?" She hesitated half a second too long. "If you miss this, you lose everything." Then she smiled like she had said something helpful. That sentence stayed with me all the way home. People always think betrayal begins with one dramatic moment. It does not. Usually it starts years earlier, in small scenes you excuse because you are tired, or in love, or busy surviving. The first incident happened the month after my mother's funeral. I was 24, standing in the old kitchen with flour on my jeans, trying to keep the shop open with 1 part-time cashier and a leaking freezer. Grant was still my boyfriend then. A bank manager came in to discuss a line of credit. He asked me 3 direct questions about margins, overhead, and seasonal booking. I answered all 3. Then Grant stepped in front of me, put a hand lightly at my back, and said, "What Tessa means is she's brilliant with product, but I handle the serious side." The bank manager looked at him after that. Grant said later, "Don't be sensitive, I was helping." The second incident came at our wedding rehearsal dinner. My sister Ava raised a glass and laughed. Tessa finally found someone who can keep her from giving away the whole store to every sad-eyed customer with a story. Everyone laughed, even me, because that is what scapegoats do in functional clothes. We laugh 1 beat late and tell ourselves we are included. There were dozens of moments like that. Grant correcting me in front of staff, Ava calling me emotional whenever I questioned an invoice or a contract. Me putting the phone face down and going back to kneading dough because there were orders to fill and rent to pay and life to keep moving. What changed was the surgery. It was minor, technically, gallbladder, outpatient, but anesthesia gives opportunists the opening they love. While I was recovering, Grant filed amended operating documents for a holding company called Rowan Hospitality Group, LLC. He transferred vendor contracts, our kitchen equipment lease, and, most importantly, the Gala sponsorship revenue into the new entity. On paper, it looked clean, efficient, temporary. It would have worked too if he had not been arrogant. The first clue came from Delia Park, a 70-year-old florist who had supplied our events since before I could drive. She called me that Thursday and asked, "Honey, why did a courier pick up your donor seating chart from the office? And why was your sister asking which board members are sentimental about your mother?" My chest went cold. I told her I would call back. Then I drove to the bakery, still sore, moving slower than I wanted to admit. Our office door was locked. That had never happened before. Through the glass, I could see file boxes stacked near the desk and one yellow key card sitting beside the printer. The night cleaner, Mr. Molina, saw me and said quietly, "Your husband left in a hurry. He dropped this." He handed me the key card like he was passing a note in church. I used it to get into the small records room at the rear of the building. That is where I found 2 folders. The first was labeled Gala. It held revised donor agreements, a rebranded step and repeat muck-up, and a program draft with Grant listed as founder and executive chair, not co-owner, not managing partner, founder. The second folder changed everything. Inside were 3 things: a draft affidavit claiming I had become medically impaired and unfit to manage company obligations, a notarized signature page with a date from the day I was under anesthesia, and a memo about activating a canary clause in my late mother's trust. I sat down on the floor to read it twice. My mother's trust had a fraud carve-out tied to management succession. If any beneficiary or spouse attempted to seize control through coercion, forged signatures, or medical incapacity claims, their interest would be suspended and the business would transfer into supervised stewardship under the trust's independent counsel. I had signed that trust with my mother when I was 26. I remembered almost none of the legal language. Grant apparently remembered even less. He had built his whole plan around a forged incapacity narrative without realizing my mother had anticipated that exact kind of theft. I should say this plainly. I was not immediately brave. I was furious, yes, but also nauseated and scared. Pain has a way of making you practical. I went home, locked the door, and cried for 6 straight minutes with my forehead against the kitchen cabinet. Then I washed my face and called the only person my husband had always said was too old school to matter. Eleanor Voss had been my mother's attorney. She answered on the second ring. I said, "I think my husband forged a notarized medical document and triggered my mother's trust by accident." There was a small pause. Then Eleanor said, "Bring me everything, tonight." Her office smelled like cedar and paper and old money that did not need to announce itself. She wore a navy suit and reading glasses on a chain and had the unsettling calm of someone who had already won arguments in her head before the other side finished speaking. She read every page without interrupting. Then she set the affidavit down and asked, "Did you sign this?" "No." "Were you conscious on this date and time?" "I was in recovery." She nodded once. "Good. That makes this cleaner." Cleaner was not the word I would have used, but I appreciated the confidence. She explained the mechanics piece by piece. The notarized page was vulnerable if the witness log did not match. The LLC transfer could be challenged if it relied on fraudulent authority. The canary clause in the trust gave us leverage before any final seizure of the business. The Gala board meeting on Friday was where Grant intended to formalize perception. Once donors, vendors, and trustees heard a unified story that I was unstable and stepping back voluntarily, unraveling it would become harder. He was not just taking money. He was manufacturing consent. Eleanor folded her hands. "This isn't revenge. This is justice." I breathed out slowly. Then she said, "And justice needs sequence." By midnight, we had a plan. First, Eleanor filed an emergency petition to freeze any asset transfers connected to Magnolia Table and Rowan Hospitality Group pending review of contested authority. Asset freeze, 2 words that sound dry until you realize they can stop a thief mid-step. Second, she contacted the hospital's compliance office to secure the exact anesthesia timeline and post-op charting. If Grant wanted to claim I had knowingly signed, we would place my medical status beside his date stamp. Third, she sent a quiet request to the notary's office listed on the affidavit. That part came back faster than expected. The notary seal belonged to a man named Joel Fenwick, who had died 11 months earlier. I stared at the email twice, then a third time. Grant had used an obsolete digital stamp image. Arrogance again. But the strongest break came from somewhere else entirely. Remember Delia, the florist? She called again Friday morning and said, "You might want to know your husband rescheduled the Gala speaking order. He moved you off the program and added Pastor Neil from the Heritage Foundation as keynote witness to your transition." That was the social twist I had not seen coming. Pastor Neil chaired one of the donor family's foundations. He had also known my mother. If he stood beside Grant in public, the room would lean his way before evidence ever hit the table. So Eleanor made one more call. At noon, Pastor Neil received a sealed envelope containing copies of the forged affidavit, the fake notarization, and the clause from my mother's trust. He was not a dramatic man, which helped. Dramatic men make things about themselves. Serious men make things stop. By 6 that evening, the gala venue glittered with candlelight and polished silver. It was at the Ashcroft House, one of those restored mansions where everyone lowers their voice half a step the second they enter. I wore a dark green dress that did not quite hide how tired I was. My incisions still pulled when I stood too straight. I remember that because it kept me from moving too fast. Pain can protect dignity that way. Grant saw me near the entrance and actually smiled. "Tessa," he said softly, as if I had arrived exactly as planned. "I'm glad you came. Let's keep this graceful." Ava touched my arm and whispered, "Please don't embarrass yourself." I looked at both of them and thought, "You really think the room belongs to you?" Then I waited. That was the hardest part, not exposing them too early. Not flinching when 2 board members asked if I was feeling stronger, not reacting when Grant told a donor, within my hearing, she needs rest. This transition is for her own good. The first reveal was small. During the welcome remarks, Grant thanked sponsors, praised family continuity, and announced an exciting restructuring that would position Magnolia Table for regional expansion. He said it smoothly. He always did. Then he invited Pastor Neil to join him on stage. Pastor Neil walked up, adjusted the microphone, and said, "Before I endorse any transition, I need clarity on whether the current ownership documents are authentic." The room changed shape. It was subtle at first, a rustle, a shift of posture. Grant's smile held, but only by force. He replied, "Of course they are." That was when Eleanor stepped forward from the side aisle and handed the event coordinator a packet. The coordinator, visibly confused, gave one to each board member. The second reveal was bigger. Eleanor introduced herself as counsel to the Rowan Family Trust and stated, in a voice that never rose, that a petition for emergency asset freeze had already been filed that afternoon based on evidence of forged authority, false medical incapacity claims, and attempted fraudulent transfer of trust-protected assets. Someone at table 6 actually put down a fork. Grant tried to laugh. "This is a misunderstanding," Eleanor said. "Then perhaps you can explain why the affidavit bears a notary seal assigned to a man deceased since last spring." Silence landed hard. Ava went pale before Grant did. He looked at her. That told me more than any confession could have. The third reveal was nuclear. Eleanor handed the AV technician a flash drive. On the main screen behind the podium appeared a series of metadata screenshots from the forged affidavit file. Creation source, Grant's home laptop. Revision history, Ava's office email. Export timestamp, during my surgical recovery period. Beneath it appeared the hospital timeline, showing I was under supervised post-anesthesia care when the voluntary signature was supposedly executed. Then Pastor Neil, to his everlasting credit, stepped back from the podium and said only this: "Mary Rowan built this business to feed people, employ people, and leave something clean behind. I will not witness theft dressed as stewardship." The room did the rest. 2 donors stood up and walked away from Grant mid-sentence. Delia crossed her arms like a satisfied general. One board member asked for immediate suspension of all restructuring votes. Another requested outside forensic audit of every transfer in the last 90 days. Someone near the back whispered, "My God," which was unnecessary but accurate. Grant finally lost his temper. He pointed at me and said, "You have no idea what this business needs. I made it scalable. I made it investable. Without me, it's just a grief project with frosting." That line did more damage to him than anything we had presented, because now the mask was off. I did not raise my voice. I did not give a speech. I said, "My mother left me recipes, not weakness. You confused access with ownership." Ava tried one last move. "Tessa, please, we were trying to protect you." I looked at her and asked, "From what? My own signature?" There are rooms where truth arrives slowly. This was not one of them. By 9 that night, the board had voted to suspend all authority tied to Rowan Hospitality Group, freeze Gala disbursements, and cooperate with formal review. Grant left through the side exit. Ava followed 10 steps behind, crying the way people cry when consequences finally feel expensive. The official consequence came 2 months later in probate and civil court. By then, the forensic audit had mapped everything: misdirected deposits, altered vendor agreements, a shell consulting invoice routed through an entity Ava controlled, email drafts coordinating the incapacity narrative, even a message from Grant complaining that the old trust language is a nuisance. The courtroom went silent when Eleanor introduced the original trust provision and then the hospital records beside the forged affidavit. Not because people were surprised anymore, but because precision has its own drama. The judge issued a continuing asset freeze, voided the contested transfers, referred the forged notarization for criminal investigation, and granted a protective order barring Grant from representing Magnolia Table or accessing its financial systems. Ava settled before trial, surrendered her side arrangements, and disappeared from my daily life with remarkable speed. No one went to prison in some cinematic way. This was not that kind of story. Real justice is often paperwork, hearings, restitution schedules, barred access, damaged reputations, and doors that no longer open when certain people pull, which for me was enough. 1 year later, Magnolia Table was still standing. Actually, more than standing. We had reduced the event load, expanded our bread program, and opened a teaching kitchen in the rear studio under my mother's name. I hired a real controller. I read every contract myself. I slept more. Not perfectly, but enough. The charity gala returned too, smaller and better, with local scholarships for culinary apprentices, and no one on stage who needed applause to feel tall. Grant was consulting somewhere in Florida under a different company name the last I heard. The donor world has a long memory for forged paper. Ava sent one apology email 6 months after settlement. I read it once, then archived it. Boundaries are not always speeches. Sometimes they are folders you never reopen. People still ask whether I regret not seeing it sooner. No, I regret the pain. I regret the humiliation. I regret how easily love can be used to soften your attention. But I do not regret what came after, because after all of it, I learned something that has protected me better than trust ever did. Self-worth is not proven by how long you endure disrespect. It is proven by what you refuse to sign, excuse, or normalize once the truth is in front of you. Sometimes I still think about that yellow key card, the small object that looked unimportant until it opened the right door. Most endings are like that. They begin with one overlooked thing, one page, one timestamp, one old clause written by someone who loved you enough to plan for your blindness as well as your strength. So that is my question for you. Have you ever looked back and realized the warning signs were small, but the pattern was not? And if this kind of story is your kind of story, subscribe and stay with me. The next one starts with a funeral, a locked desk, and a receipt no one thought to destroy.